Hey, what's up everybody? Welcome back. Infamous here with battleofthebuild.com. If you're looking for ESO builds and looking for ESO gameplay, be sure to check out battleofthebuild.com. It is your #1 source for all of ESO PvP content, especially in terms of a variety of builds for all of the classes, whether you play Stamina, Magicka, or Hybrid. And of course, there's a lot of information for building builds, etc. Coming back today with a discussion on Necromancer. I guess a little bit we're going to be jumping right into Stamina Necromancer. For this particular build, this is my medium armored Pale Rider, medium armored Stamina Necromancer. And medium armored Stamina Necromancer, even for the upcoming patch, is actually still very strong. Blast Bones is still going to be doing a lot of damage. The primary problem, which I say all the time, in how to fix Necromancer is, one, the Blast Bones should be untargetable. It should be untargetable so that it cannot be rooted, it cannot be stunned, it can't be slowed, it won't get stuck in the gates, etc. It won't get rooted. Like if someone drops Wall of Ice, it doesn't sit there, get slowed. If someone petrifies it, CCs it, etc. And because it's primarily the Necromancer's main source of burst. And if they lose that ability, then that would also fix the amount of issues with it being very buggy with the pathing. So I think that's like the #1 priority in trying to fix Necromancer. For this particular build, I was not running the Pestilence. The Pestilent Colossus, the Colossus itself did get nerfed in terms of the ability to offer major vulnerability. The major vulnerability now only comes in on the last hit instead of on every hit, and that was a PvE change. That was a PvE change that is affecting PvP. Primarily, it's a change because in endgame PvE, major vulnerability is so strong that most people were just running endgame Stamina Necromancers, because endgame Stamina Necromancers outparse magicka Necromancers by a long way. Magicka Necromancers are very weak, especially standalone in PvP. Magicka Necromancers are very weak. Comparative to all magicka builds, I would say they are the weakest. Magicka Necromancer is the weakest of the magicka Necromancers, while Stamina Necromancer is very strong by comparatively. And I would say Stamina Necromancer is probably, in terms of its burst outside of Broken Cloak, is probably the strongest in terms of its damage and in terms of its utility. I would say Stamina Necromancer is probably your top class in terms of damage output, outside of just like broken builds and broken abilities. In terms of Stamina Necromancer's ability to put out damage, it is by far the strongest class. One thing that made it really strong, which I entirely disagreed with, was the change to Mortal Coil. Mortal Coil was entirely overbuffed, and especially in the current patch. You know, just taking a look at the build that I run, you can see it right here, and I discussed this, and I believe they probably nerfed it. I don't even have items on my character, but looking at it on live, this is a no CP, and I talk about no CP battlegrounds primarily because no CP battlegrounds is where competitive play takes place. Not talking about open world, 1vxing. It's not competitive because the purpose of those play styles is fighting players who don't know how to play. In battlegrounds is typically more geared towards competitive play style where people know how to play, they know how to CC break, they know how to dodge roll, they know how to protect themselves, situational roll dodge, blocking, etc. And so for competitive play, Necromancers actually overperform. Stamina Necromancers actually overperform for the risk reward, for the amount of damage that you can get, right? You can see the effectiveness right here for the Stamina Necromancers coming in at almost 8,500 effective weapon damage. And that's very high for a build running 5,500 weapon damage. This is a medium armored build. You can see the tooltips here on the abilities, almost 14k dizzy. My stampede is 6k. My blast bones is almost 16k on live. My rally heal is 5k. This is without major mending, right? This is without major mending. My rally heal is 5k. And of course, that's running Camouflage Hunter. You can see my Flawless Dawnbreaker is coming in at 12.6 and a 16.5 dot. And this is primarily where Stamina Necromancer is too strong, and it's primarily right here in Mortal Coil. And even though Spirit Guardian did get nerfed, you can see the heal for the 16-second duration. this ability is providing 10% mitigation along with a 16,000 hot. Yes, it is over the course of 16 seconds. It casts every 2 seconds. It provides you roughly 1200 HP every 2 seconds, but it also gives you 10% mitigation along with 200 more magic recovery and stamina recovery. And a lot of the Necromancer damage over time can be removed via hexproof. And especially because you have so much HP coming in between Mortal Coil, between Rally, Spirit Guardian, and if you're looking realistically at how much that Mortal Coil heal is in terms of heal per second, right? In no CP, in my no CP Mortal Coil is 22,000, which means it's 11k, right? It's 11k in no CP, and that's before crits, and that's before, you know, like Death Kneel, etc. So in terms of the amount of healing you're getting 11,000 healing over 12 seconds. So in terms of heal per second, that's 916 HP per second. It ticks every half second. But if you're talking about it in heal ticks, right, so you multiply that by 2. So in essence, it's providing 1,833 HP every 2 seconds, along with the extra 1200 that you're getting here. So it's an additional 1200 HP every 2 seconds. So in essence, this bursty build has 3000 HP recovery per tick, not including the burst heal that you would get from Rally, along with the removal of hexproof. It's why, in my opinion, where Stamina Necromancer and the Necromancer change for Stamina Necromancer was overperforming. I think they should have left it as a magicka ability and forced you to go hybrid. Making the ability free and having it scale made Stamina Necromancer entirely too strong, especially because Stamina Necromancer has really good damage and has really good burst potential. It shouldn't have the amount of healing that it has, because that imbalances the build. Well, one thing I will say that did change was the change to Dizzy Swing. So even though you lost the stun from Dizzy Swing, you actually still gain it on this particular morph of the two-handed ability, primarily because it provides off balance. And so you'll see you'll off balance the target, you're able to hold your heavy attack, and then that actually is a heavy attack. So in CP and in no CP, when you heavy attack someone who is in essence off balance, it provides crowd control, namely the knockdown. And the way that works is you begin the cast, immediately hold your left mouse button, and then heavy attack, and the player will get knocked down. But you don't have to hold it for the full duration. As you can see right here, I'm holding it down, and then immediately your character gets knocked out. So that's where the free crowd control comes in. Now, ZeniMax's purpose for doing that was because they wanted to decouple burst from, you know, heavy burst abilities combined with crowd control. And of course, they didn't do that by adding in off balance on Dizzy Swing. So in essence, you still gain the free CC, because it cannot be what's it called, kind of blocked, as you see right here. Well, this is a better opportunity, right? So all you have to do is do that, and that in essence is considered a heavy attack. It might be a bug. It might be considered a bug that maybe just needs to be fixed, but in the current PTS, that's exactly how that ability works, where you can Dizzy Swing as soon as you see the animation, immediately hold your left mouse button, and then as soon as the Dizzy releases, immediately release your mouse button, and you'll automatically stun your opponent for free. It'll consume the off balance, but in essence, it did not complete what ZeniMax wanted it to do, which was to decouple crowd control with heavy burst abilities. In terms of, like I said before, the only thing that really Stamina Necromancer really did not receive, at least on this particular build, this is a very burst build, still have Colossus on the back bar, still useful for the amount of damage, especially because of the Necromancer passive. One thing I will say that did need to be nerfed was the amount of damage that Skeletal Archer did for this patch in the Scale Breaker, and you can see Skeletal Archer on the current live does entirely too much damage. It's just almost 5,600 damage, and it's free. The only thing that I would say is that I would rather they make it that you can actually focus the ability. So whoever I heavy attack or whoever I'm focusing, that is the person that the Skeletal Archer will attack. And in terms of a dot, how much does Skeletal Archer deal in terms of AoE damage? As you can see on this build, it does just shy of 5,800, so just round that off to 5,800. And of course, that happens every 2 seconds, so it's times 8. So if you wanted to see how much this dot does in no CP, it's a 4,600 AoE dot. That's kind of why it needed to be nerfed. If you pick this particular morph, as it says, each time that it does AoE damage, it says the archer's attacks the closest enemy every 2 seconds, and of course this is in an AoE. The other morph, actually, excuse me, this is a single target morph. The other morph is the Skeletal Arcanist, and unfortunately, because magicka Necromancer is, miles behind stamina Necromancer, like a light armored, fairly bursty build is fairly behind on a medium armor build. One would argue, well, one is a medium up close build, the other one is a ranged build, but there's so many gap closers in ESO that you really cannot justify that unless magicka Necromancer actually had a lot of burst in their kit. Something else that I wish would get changed would be things like detonating siphon. You can see the tooltip in no CP. This is a no CP build. Detonating siphon coming in at 25.5k damage over the course of 12 seconds, and it's free, and it does an additional 7,800. What I would love for them to do is just make it so that whoever you target, right, with blast bones, as soon as your blast bones lands, you automatically be able to, as you see, blast bones will land, and then I would be able to detonate the blast bones for actual AoE damage. And so this would actually keep the ability viable for PvE while making it viable in PvP. As it currently it is useless. The ability is currently useless in PvE because it serves no function because of the tether. That's primarily because of the tether. Right, so blast bones would go out, it immediately hit the target, it would blow up, and then I would immediately blow up that target. As you can see, that puff of poison that you see right there would be the animation, but it would be just a little bit bigger, and then that person, and then whoever got caught in the AoE would take the poison damage over time. And so what this would do is it'd make the ability actually viable for PvP because it's completely useless, and it also forces you to be tethered to the target. Some people have said, well, why not make it tethered to the person? I would still think that it would still force you to not be able to line of sight. So the most important thing is that it doesn't allow you to line of sight, because the moment you line of sight, it immediately breaks. And so this would actually be better gameplay. Same thing with, for example, Mortal Coil. I wish that they would do the exact same thing with the Mortal Coil, so that when you kill someone, instead of having to stay within range, as you can see right there, like the moment you actually gain any sort of real line of sight, actually even here it kind of cuts through, but the moment you gain any sort of line of sight, it immediately dissipates, so you lose the healing and you lose the stamina regen, which basically forces Necromancer, primarily magicka Necromancer that lacks mobility, primarily forces that playstyle to be more of a stand your ground playstyle, and Necromancer really doesn't put out enough damage to be able to play as a stand your ground playstyle. It's kind of why I disagreed with them buffing Mortal Coil too much. What they could have done, what they could have just done, was make magicka Necromancer more viable. And I typically talk about in terms of effectiveness on most builds. If you're looking to play a more bursty, reliable killing build, you typically want to sit above 7,000. Whether you're a magicka build, you want to sit above 7,000 effective spell power, or you want to be above 7,000 effective weapon power. And this is kind of how you can see where builds are too strong and where builds are too weak. And so looking at the magicka Necromancer on what I would say is probably the most well-balanced build that you could get for no CP, my magicka Necromancer is just shy of 28k magicka. I'm running 33, almost 3,700 spell damage with almost 28k magicka, and I got 41% crit, and you can see my regions right here: 1890 regen, 1160 HP regen with 1232 stamina recovery. And in terms of the actual effectiveness of this playstyle, it's actually kind of weak on the 6400 6,400 effective spell power. The reason being is because, one, magicka Necromancer gets forced into this sort of stand your ground playstyle, especially in light, because you need things like Mortal Coil. Mortal Coil on Stamina Necromancer is super strong. Mortal Coil on magicka Necromancer, not so strong. Blast Bones on Stamina Necromancer, really strong. Like, what did I say? It was almost 15k on magicka Necromancer, just shy of 11k. No real spammable. You lose your ability to crowd control. You probably would have to run something like Destructive Staff and run the other morph that doesn't have the dot for a whopping 3k damage. Very expensive, very expensive. Or you could utilize Totem, but I've often said Totem is subpar because when you need an immediate CC, let's say you get hit by a Night Plague, you need the immediate pressure relief. Totem is not going to give you that. It requires a 2-second delay and the animation of it casting, and it's a ground effect, so it's a little bit slower on terms of casting it. And then there's the huge delay. You could say, well, you know, you're running a Nord on Necromancer, which on a stand your ground build, you're going to need the extra resistances because you get forced into the stand your ground playstyle. But even if I were to play, let's say, like, let's just say I went High Elf, right? Even if I went for High Elf, you're really not going to get too much out of it. So my effectiveness goes to just shy of 6k, but then 18k is pretty weak for 18k physical resistance with 20k spell resistance. It's pretty weak in terms of your ability to put out damage. Sure, you gain a little bit more recovery because of the passives from it. You get a little bit more max magic. You see, you do gain an almost 5% boost, but I don't think it's worth it for the tankiness that you lose and the extra amount of ult gen that you lose, because Necromancer ults are very expensive. What you do gain is you gain more spell powers. You see I'm sitting almost 37. You gain a little bit more max magicka, and then of course you gain a little bit more of stamina recovery because of spell recharge. But since there are no channels or casting abilities, you don't gain the benefit of the extra 5% less damage. And so I would say Nord is going to be your best bet because of the forced stand your ground gameplay. You gain the resistances to frost as well as the extra health, as well as the chill status effects, which means people utilizing ice builds or ice staff, you're not going to be rooted. The other thing that you get is you gain the extra survivability because of the max stamina, which allows you to block, roll dodge, CC break a little bit more. The extra ult, which Necromancer abilities are very expensive, and of course you want as much physical and spell resistance as you can see, almost 4k. That is more resistance than the actual 5%. So that 3960 that you get divided by 660, which is considered 1% mitigation. So this is roughly 6%. So this is guaranteed 6% damage reduction. Whereas on, for example, if you were running High Elf, that 5% reduction is only when casting or via casting or channeled abilities. So it's very situational, not very useful for a magicka Necromancer. Where magicka Necromancer is lacking, I would say it's primarily in their utility with Blast Bones. Again, same point, because Blast Bones is both targeted as well as it can be, you know, CC'd, rooted, slowed, etc. If you're fighting like there's a negate. If there's a negate down, the Necromancer, the skeleton will run, hit the negate, and then just stop there. You know, just stop it sitting at the gate. So the primary purpose is you actually gain an additional 50% sitting back cast. But for the most part, I mean, outside of open world Cyrodiil, like a Zerg versus Zerg, you lose a lot of the secondary function of it. You might gain 1 or 2 casts before you get gap closed by an opponent, and then that secondary portion of it goes out the window. Whereas the stamina version always functions because it gives you the major defile. What I would say is that Ricochet probably needs speed up the animation, because it's really easy. It's really easy for the animation to be avoided. Not so much from, like, if you're running a stamina Necromancer, but on a ranged caster, very easily to get avoided. A lot of the damage that comes out from Necromancer is ranged abilities that are easily avoided via dodge roll. What I would say is that Unfortunately, you end up having to utilize this as your only source of fairly viable crowd control. Entirely too expensive for what it does. It's 2430 magicka for only in no CP. It's only going to do about 1600 damage, if that. I would say, you know, magicka Necromancer would need something. I would probably rather see Blast Bones get something else than the extra damage on the range. I'm not quite sure what. Of course, the same thing is said true of magicka Necromancer in terms of Skeletal Mage. You can see the Skeletal Mage on this build fairly weak, coming in at 3800, and it's AoE, so it's reduced by things like Major Evasion. Same thing, I would like where the Skeletal Arcanist would focus the person that you're hitting and not be AoE damage, and at least then it would maybe garner a bit of a buff, because since it's not AoE damage, which is kind of why it shouldn't be buffed if it's considered AoE, because you can hit multiple targets, even though it's a small 4-meter colonel. I think in ZeniMax's eyes, because it's an AoE, it shouldn't deal as much damage, and I'm all in favor of this ability not being an AoE and being made single target. So whoever I heavy attack, it automatically focuses that person, and then the Arcanist actually maybe can be given a buff. For example, maybe make it the minor spell fracture, so that would increase the overall effectiveness of magicka Necromancer's ability to fight back in PvP, because it's missing quite a bit of effective spell power. My stamina build is a Nord. My magicka build is also a Nord, because of the stand your ground playstyle. I rarely see magicka Necromancers outside of, like, I don't see burst magicka Necromancers. I haven't seen a burst magicka Necromancer build. This is a fairly bursty build with 63%, 73% spell critical damage, with 41% spell critical in light armor, with 3370 spell power, with 27k magicka. 27k magicka. This is a no CP build with an additional 1500 pen, and it still doesn't come out with a lot of damage, because it's primarily, most of your damage abilities are going to be via Stalking Blast Bones. I even have access to Minor Force here. What I would say where Necromancer probably could be buffed would be here in Mystic. Same thing with Mystic Siphon, because at least this would give me a little bit more of AoE dot damage, which Necromancer is missing. And I could probably drop Embrace as a utility skill and maybe put this in here, and give Stalking Blast Bones something else outside of the 50% to range, because that really is sort of lacking. The other thing that got nerfed in magicka Necromancer is the amount of damage that unnerving does in the current patch. On the PTS, unnerving did get nerfed in the amount of damage that it does. What I would say that the game style that is preserved is that if you're running Harmony and you're just using it for the synergy still works just fine. That gameplay is still preserved, although it is kind of gimmicky. But in terms of just being able to cast and trade against other magicka builds, magicka Necromancer lacks a lot of damage. It lacks a lot of damage, as well as lacking a bit of utility. Where magicka Necromancer does get strong is when it does bring an opponent down below 25%, and that's because of Death Kneel. And you can see Death Kneel really pushes your effective spell power up. And so I would say magicka Necromancer needs like a little buff, a little bit of a buff, to probably bring it to around 7,000, so that when it gets his opponent into execute range, it would probably put it like around 8,000 effective spell power. And just taking a look to see how much you would get out of the the minor fracture, not the minor fracture, could give it minor vulnerability. For example, if you were using on the Mage Arcanist could offer minor vulnerability. If Mystic Siphon were made useful, then you'd actually get minor vulnerability from the chance to proc a to proc the minor vulnerability from shock. So that's another way that magicka Necromancer. I'm not even sure if I'm actually utilizing here. I'm using magicka. Yeah, I'm not. And I think it was because I was having sustain issues, which is another thing with magicka Necromancer. So if you were to make the Arcanist deal magicka to gain the minor vulnerability, let's see how much would that increase the effectiveness of the build. I would say that would be a fairly good amount of damage that it's missing. And then if you wanted it to be a little bit more powerful, you can actually put in the physical, just the spell reduction. Where's the minor one? Here we go, minor breach. So from 69, that would put you at 71. And then since you don't have an execute and you don't have access to an execute, when Death Knell procs, that would put you at 8,300. And that would be very respectable for a build and for a class that is designed around a lot of stand your ground play, especially because magicka Necromancer lacks mobility, as well as it, and of course it's not in terms of the healing. Stamina Necromancer has much better healing because of rally, because of a stronger mortal coil, and intensive mender. Of course, when you have other teammates around you, it can heal other people. So I would say to make magicka Necromancer better, I would say to give them access to using Mystic Siphon so that they could gain the minor vulnerability from shock, especially because the major vulnerability from Colossus is very easily avoided because it's only on the last hit. Since they made it only on the last hit, that is a huge portion of damage that they pulled away from magicka Necromancer in the Dragonhold patch. And unfortunately, because Stamina Necromancer is really strong, and they nerfed it, magicka Necromancer suffered the most because magicka Necromancer is far behind Stamina Necromancer. And I would say that's one way. Maybe giving the Skeletal Arcanist, making it single target, and then making Mystic Siphon more viable so that you could, for example, I could drop Ghostly Embrace and utilize this on my back bar, making this an AoE, dealing AoE shock damage so that I have access to minor vulnerability, and then making this what you could do is you could actually make the Arcanist offer crowd control, where it does damage over time, but then maybe like every second cast or every third cast, guarantees a CC. It does kind of like a knockback animation when it hits, and it procs the minor breach. Or give it just minor breach and give them access to something else, so that the effective weapons power in terms of the build, in terms of the class itself being viable, in terms of killing other competent builds, magicka Necromancer, I would say, is lacking. I would say about 10 or so % effective spell power to make it a very strong and viable playstyle for Battlegrounds.